septum truncation here, this whole part of the shell here was dropped off. This again makes for a very streamlined shell, and I think these things are probably nectonic swimmers. So we find all of these various body plans in the Ordovician. If we look at Nautiloids shells, and we're trying to differentiate between different Nautiloid taxa, we use a variety, a combination of both external and internal features of the cephalopod shell. A lot of the Nautiloids we get in the Cincinnatian are these longiconic forms. And one of the things we use to differentiate these is the shape of the cone, or how rapidly it expands. This is called the angle of expansion, or the apical angle here. You have these gradually very gracile, slender, gradually expanding forms where this angle is less than 5 or 6 degrees. You have these moderately expanding forms where this angle's about between 6 and 8 degrees. And then you have these rapidly expanding forms where this angle is more than 9 degrees. So these are all cones, but the shape of the cone is different depending upon this angle here. This is a cross-sectional shape cutting through the nautiloid. We have a variety of different forms. Again, most of these longiconic forms have a circular cross-section. This is Trochilides, which is a coiled form and has a depressed cross-sectional profile. And this is Beloitoceras, which is one of these certicones. It has a laterally compressed profile. So we can look at the cross-sectional shape of the shell as well. One of the other things we usually see in fossil nautiloids, the outer shell is rarely preserved. It's typically aragonitic, and aragonite doesn't hold up very well. And so a lot of times what you get are an infilling of the inside of the shell. And so you get an infilling of the camerae, the gas chambers that make up the fragmented. And you can see differences amongst different taxa here. This is Carter's from the Tyrone limestone, which is early late Ordovician in Kentucky. You can see these septa, or these lines here. They're very closely spaced. The individual gas chambers are very narrow, so the camerae are very shallow or very short. This is Treptoceras, which is the ubiquitous nautiloid in the Cincinnati, and you can see the chambers here. The septa are a little more spaced out. The septa are a little deeper. And then finally, you come down here. This is Plurorthoceras. The septa are, again, spaced even further apart, and you have much deeper camerae. So we can use these features, again, to differentiate these forms that on the surface seem to look very similar. Another thing we can look at is ornamentation. Occasionally you do get the outside of the shell preserved, and you can get the development of longitudinal ribs, like this form here, which is Isoorthoceras albersi. You can get forms with incised longitudinal furrows, like this form here, and you can get forms with these transverse annuli. And this is Monomanchides, which is also from Tyrone, which ended the Cincinnati. Prior to the 1900s, people used primarily the external features of the shell to differentiate the different kinds of nautiloids. Primarily with August Firsty and Kurt Teichert and Russo Flower in the early part of the 20th century, the focus on differentiating nautiloid taxa and looking at their evolution focused more on the internal features of the shell, particularly this siphuncular tube, which runs from the body chamber through the chambered part, the fragmacone part of the shell. And so a lot of the differentiation, again, of these longiconic forms has to do now with the internal structures. Up here at the top, Steve Aronoff, who was a UC graduate, published a really nice, unfortunately obscure paper in 1979 that came up with a systematic approach to a quantifiable approach to looking at the features of the siphuncle. One of the things he developed was a siphuncle position ratio here, which locates where the axis of the siphuncle is within the shell here. So you can have mid-dorsal, central, mid-ventral, ventral. All of these then could be used to identify where the siphuncle was within the shell. We also look at the shape of the siphuncle segment here, primarily the length versus the height. You have depressed forms here, which he developed what was called the siphuncle or segment compression ratio. If it was less than 1, the length of the segment was greater than the height, and you ended up with a depressed or tubular segment. If the length and the height were more or less the same or equal axial, you would have this type of shape. And if the height was greater than the length, this SCR number was greater than 1, you would have this type of segment, which is compressed. Besides the position and the shape of the siphuncle, we also look at some of the deposits, the ballast deposits that are used to counterweight these longiconic shells. And you get the development of deposits that were secreted by the animal when it was alive. These are in the camerae, so they're called cameral deposits. This type here, which looks like a pillow shape, is called a mural cameral deposit. And this one here, which is kind of pushed up against the septa and the outer wall of the shell here, is called an episeptal cameral deposit. And this form down here, which is Ordovician, has episeptal and also what are called hyposeptal deposits. So we can look at the cameral deposits, we can look at the deposits that are inside the siphuncle as well. And we see a variety of different types of forms in the Ordovician here in the Cincinnatian. This is a ventral rod. This is a solid rod of calcite that is secreted aethically in the animal and peters out as you get towards the living part of the shell over here. This is an endosauroid, which are very large ventral siphuncle that's filled in with these cone and cone structures that are called endocones. And then this is Streptosaurus over here, which has these deposits ventrally that fuse to form what are called parietal deposits in these dorsal annuli that form on the ends of the septum. And then this is Actinosaurus. We don't find this in the Cincinnatian, but it's down in the Lexington and really common in the Tyrone. It has very massive deposits that are called annulosiphonate deposits that eventually fill in most of this large diameter siphuncle. So these are some of the characteristic features that we use to differentiate different kinds of mollusks. Again, nautiloids are locally abundant in the late Ordovician Cincinnatian series exposed in the tri-state area. They're dominated by a variety of orthoconic longicones with far fewer numbers of some of these other shell types. Stratigraphic collections were described by S.A. Miller in the late 1800s, by August Firsty in the early 1900s, by Russo Flower. Particularly in 1946, he wrote the Bible basically on nautiloids in the Cincinnatian. American paleontology here, Cincinnati, and Ordovician cephalopods of the Cincinnati region. And then I added my piece in 1995 when I published Middle and Upper Ordovician Nautiloid Cephalopods of the Cincinnati region. So nautiloids are common in the Cincinnati, and they're variably preserved, and the diversity and the different kinds of nautiloids varies depending on where you're at in the section. This is another nice color chart I stole from Dave and Richard's book, showing you